It was a new moon night, which meant the darkness was absolute, enveloping the road like a thick cloak. I had agreed, perhaps foolishly, to drive my friend, Michael, to his family's remote cabin in the woods. He was unusually quiet, staring ahead with a tense expression that made me uneasy. "Something wrong, Mike?" I asked as I navigated the twisting, forest-lined road. He blinked, then turned to look at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Did you see that, by the roadside?" he whispered. I hadn't seen anything but shadows, but his tone made my skin crawl. We drove on in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crunch of gravel under tires and the occasional hoot of an owl. Suddenly, Michael pointed ahead, his voice barely a hiss. There it is again." I squinted through the darkness, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a figure, pale and distorted, by the side of the road. Then it vanished. Trying to shake the unease, I focused on the road. The darkness seemed to press closer, as if it were alive, watching us. The car's headlights flickered once, twice, then steadied, but my heart raced with a sudden dread. Michael was muttering under his breath, prayers or curses, I couldn't tell. Just as I was about to ask him to stop, to calm down, there was a loud bang from the back of the car. We both jumped, and I nearly lost control of the wheel. Pulling over, heart thumping, I glanced at Michael. He was pale, his eyes fixed on something behind us. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. We got out, the air cold and crisp, the silence of the forest unnerving. The back tire was flat, torn to shreds as if by sharp claws. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't normal wear and tear. It looked deliberate, malicious even. We quickly changed the tire, the feeling of being watched never leaving us. Back on the road, the atmosphere in the car was tense, fraught with unspoken fear. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise made us flinch. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just an animal, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. We hadn't gone much further when the car's radio turned on by itself. Static filled the air, then a voice, low and distorted, spoke through the white noise. "Leave, now." It rasped, before turning back to static. Michael and I stared at each other, frozen. I reached out, turning the radio off with a shaking hand. The road seemed endless, the woods a labyrinth from which there was no escape. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching. The figure, a woman, was dressed in white, her face hidden by her long, dark hair. She didn't move, didn't seem real, but there she was, standing just a few feet from the car. Michael screamed, a sound of pure terror, and I felt my own scream catch in my throat. The woman, if she was a woman, slowly lifted her head, her eyes hollow pits of darkness, her mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished, leaving us gasping in the silent darkness. We drove on, neither of us speaking, both too scared, too confused by what we had seen. The cabin couldn't come soon enough, but with each mile, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the darkness more oppressive. When we finally arrived, the relief was palpable, but short-lived. The cabin looked abandoned, windows boarded up, the door hanging off its hinges. "This isn't how we left it," Michael whispered, his voice shaky. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the shadows that seemed to cling to the building. Something was very wrong here. We entered the cabin, the air stale and cold. It felt like stepping into a tomb. As we explored the rooms, the sense of dread grew. It was too quiet, the silence unnatural. In the living room, the furniture was covered in dust sheets, and as I pulled one away, I gasped. Underneath was not a couch, but a makeshift altar covered in dried blood and strange symbols. Michael called out from another room, and I hurried to find him standing over a hole in the floorboards. He was pale, pointing at something in the dark gap. I looked closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was a bone, large and human-looking. As we stared, a whisper filled the room, chilling us to the bone. "Welcome home," it hissed, the voice seeming to come from the walls themselves. We ran from the cabin, back to the car, our breaths loud in the silent night. As I started the engine, a figure watched from the shadows of the trees. It was the woman from the road, her smile wider, more terrifying. We drove away, the cabin disappearing behind us, but the feeling of being followed, of being hunted, remained. The road back was a nightmare, each mile fraught with shadows and whispers. When we finally reached civilization, the sun was rising, the night's horrors seeming like a distant, bad dream. But even as I dropped Michael off at his place, the fear lingered, a cold hand on the back of my neck. As I drove home, exhausted and shaken, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us from the woods, that the night's events were just the beginning. And as I pulled into my driveway, I saw it, a shadow at my window, watching, waiting. The terror was far from over. The shadow by the window didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, paralyzing. I forced myself out of the car, my steps slow, hesitant. As I approached the front door, the shadow seemed to flicker, like it was made of smoke and moonlight. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, the metal cold under my fingers. Inside, the house was silent, too silent. I called out, hoping for no answer. My voice echoed back at me, mocking my fear. I flicked on the lights, half expecting to see that figure from the woods standing in my living room. But there was nothing, just the familiar sight of home, which now felt strangely alien. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every creak of the house a whispered threat. I locked all the doors and windows, but the gesture felt futile. If what we had encountered wanted to get in, could a lock really stop it? As I sat in the living room, trying to calm my racing thoughts, the air grew inexplicably cold. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, my eyes scanning the darkness outside the windows. That's when I heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the kitchen. Heart pounding, I moved cautiously towards the sound, each step heavier than the last. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. As I reached the kitchen, the sound stopped abruptly. The room was empty, the only light from the moon casting long, sinister shadows across the floor. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. A soft, malicious laugh echoed around me, swirling in the dark. I fumbled for my phone, its light feeble in the oppressive blackness. The laugh came again, closer this time, right next to my ear. "You can't hide," it whispered, a voice so cold it made my blood freeze. I spun around, the phone's light darting across the room. Nothing. I was alone, or at least I appeared to be. The light from my phone flickered, then steadied, and I used it to make my way back to the living room. The air felt thicker, as if filled with unspoken threats. I tried to stay awake, the TV on low, casting flickering light across the room. But exhaustion pulled at my eyelids. I must have dozed off, because I woke with a start. The TV was static, the room colder than before. That's when I saw it, the figure from the woods, standing at the edge of the light, watching me. Its eyes were hollows of despair, its mouth a twisted gash. It moved towards me, slow, deliberate, I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body as frozen as my heart. It stopped just inches away, its face close to mine. "You brought this upon yourself," it hissed, its breath a stench of decay. Suddenly, the room was filled with whispers, voices overlapping, each one crying out in pain and anger. I covered my ears, but the voices were inside my head, a cacophony of horror. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, the voices dying away, leaving me gasping for breath in the silent house. I knew I couldn't stay here, not with the shadows and whispers. I grabbed my keys, my coat, anything I thought I might need. As I opened the front door, the night air hit me, cold and unwelcoming. But it was better than the terror inside. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house seemed normal, quiet under the starless sky. But I knew better. I drove without direction, the events of the past few hours replaying in my mind. Where could I go? Who would believe this tale of shadows and whispers? The road was empty, the landscape barren under the moonlight. I felt adrift, caught between the known and the unknown. Every mile took me further from home, but there was no safety in distance. The darkness was a companion now, one I couldn't escape. I stopped for gas at a lonely station on the outskirts of a small town. The attendant eyed me warily, his face creased with suspicion. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice gruff. I nodded, unable to muster a smile. "You might want to stay clear of the old Miller place," he continued, nodding towards the dark road that twisted into the woods. "Bad things happen there." I froze, the warning echoing my own fears. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He shrugged, a gesture of indifference that belied the intensity of his gaze. "Folks say it's haunted, cursed. Whatever it is, people go there, but they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I thanked him, my mind racing with the implications of his warning. As I drove towards the Miller place, drawn by a morbid curiosity, the night seemed to close in around me. The road was a tunnel of shadows, each turn revealing only more darkness. And then, in the middle of nowhere, my car stopped. No warning, no sputter of a dying engine, just silence. I tried to start it, but it was as dead as the night. I was alone, utterly alone, in the darkness. And that's when I heard it, a soft sobbing coming from the woods beside the road. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, as if someone, or something, was in profound agony. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat echoing in the oppressive silence of the night. Cautiously, I stepped out of the car, the air cold and sharp against my skin. The darkness seemed to envelop me, a suffocating blanket that I couldn't escape. As I edged closer to the source of the sound, the sobbing morphed into a mournful wail, chilling me to the bone. The woods were dense, the trees like specters watching my every move. I hesitated, the instinct to flee nearly overwhelming. Yet, something pulled me deeper into the darkness, a morbid curiosity or perhaps something more sinister. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, roots and rocks hidden in the shadows, ready to trip me. The sobbing was right ahead now, so close I could almost feel the sorrow it carried. I stopped, my breath visible in the cold night air, my hands trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. There was a sudden silence, heavy and ominous. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her face pale, her eyes hollow with grief. She was dressed in a tattered gown that seemed to belong to another century. She looked at me, her gaze piercing. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a broken echo of despair. I stepped back, my mind reeling. "Who are you?" I stammered. She moved closer, her form wavering as if made of mist. "I am lost," she said, "trapped in this night, unable to escape." Her hands reached out, grasping at the air between us. "Please, help me find my way." The air grew colder, a frost that seemed to seep into my bones. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but her eyes held me, a prisoner of her grief. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Free me," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "Break the curse that binds me to these woods." Her form began to fade, becoming more ethereal. "Please, before the night reclaims me." Her plea was a weight on my soul, a burden I had no choice but to bear. I nodded, unsure of what I was agreeing to, but compelled by her desperation. "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice steady despite my fear. She pointed to the heart of the woods, where the trees were darkest. "There lies the source of my bondage, a stone marked with ancient runes. Destroy it, and I shall be free." Her form was fading fast, her voice now just a breeze in the leaves. Armed with only my phone's flashlight, I ventured deeper into the woods. The darkness was absolute, the light from my phone a feeble barrier against the night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my heart racing with terror. After what seemed like an eternity, I found it, a large stone covered in moss and vines, runes carved deep into its surface. They glowed with an eerie light, casting sinister shadows on the ground. I touched the stone, the surface cold and pulsating with a malevolent energy. I searched for something, anything, to destroy the stone. Nearby, I found a heavy branch, fallen and forgotten. With all my strength, I struck the stone. The sound was thunderous, echoing through the woods like a gunshot. Again and again, I hit the stone, each strike a plea for the woman's release. Finally, the stone cracked, a jagged line running through the runes. A scream filled the air, a sound of pain and fury, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. I fell to my knees, covering my head as the world shook. When the tremors stopped, I looked up. The stone was shattered, pieces of it scattered around like the remnants of a terrible storm. The runes no longer glowed, their power broken. The forest felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. I made my way back to the road, the path clearer now, the oppressive feeling of the woods gone. As I reached my car, I looked back. The woman was there, at the edge of the woods. She smiled, a sad yet beautiful smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice fading into the night wind. Then she vanished, leaving me alone under the starless sky. Exhausted, I drove away from the woods, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I knew I had changed something, broken a chain of sorrow that had held for centuries. But as I left the shadows of the trees behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that my actions had set other things in motion, things beyond my understanding or control. As dawn broke, the first light of the sun felt like a benediction, a promise of safety. Yet, as I drove towards home, the memory of the night clung to me, a dark whisper that would not be silenced. What had I freed in those woods? And at what cost? The road stretched before me, leading me back to the world of the living, but the shadows of the night lingered, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Driving away from the darkness of the woods, I felt a surreal peace that belied the horrors I had witnessed. The sky turned a lighter shade of blue, streaks of pink and orange painting a new day. My body ached with exhaustion, every muscle tense from the night's ordeal, but my mind raced with restless thoughts. Could I truly return to my old life after such an experience? The real world seemed distant now, like a dream from which I had abruptly awakened. The horrors of the night clung to me, a dark veil that obscured the mundane landscape passing by my window. As I drove, the sun climbed higher, its light harsh against my tired eyes. I stopped at a small diner, the mundane normality of it strangely comforting. Inside, I found a seat by the window, watching the world go about its morning, unaware of the shadows that danced just beyond their sight. The waitress brought coffee, her smile warm and inviting. "Rough night?" she asked, noticing my haggard appearance. I managed a weak smile. "Something like that," I replied, my voice hoarse. She nodded, as if recognizing the look of someone who had seen too much. "Well, take it easy, honey. You're safe here," she reassured me, her kindness a balm to my frayed nerves. I sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding me back to reality. I thought of the woman in the woods, her sorrowful plea, and the chilling events that followed. Was she truly free now? Or had I unleashed something even darker upon the world? After leaving the diner, I drove aimlessly for hours, the landscape blurring into a tapestry of greens and grays. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind, each detail sharp and vivid. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from the woods, a silent specter that lingered just out of sight. As evening approached, the sky darkened, a storm brewing on the horizon. Lightning forked across the sky, its jagged light illuminating the road ahead. Thunder rumbled, a deep, ominous sound that echoed the turmoil inside me. I found myself driving back towards the woods, drawn by a need to understand, to confront whatever remained there. The road was familiar now, each turn a reminder of my journey into darkness. As I approached the spot where I had encountered the woman, the air grew heavy, the atmosphere charged with a palpable tension. I stopped the car, the engine's hum dying into silence. The woods were dark, the trees swaying in the wind, their branches like the fingers of a grasping hand. I stepped out, the air cool and sharp against my skin. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the woods in stark, fleeting detail. I walked towards the shattered stone, the ground soft and yielding under my feet. The runes were still visible, their edges charred and broken. As I touched them, a shiver ran through me, a sense of finality that was both terrifying and profound. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it whispers of the past. I listened, my heart heavy with dread. Then a voice, clear and strong, cut through the tumult. "You have freed me," it said, the voice undoubtedly that of the woman I had helped. I looked around, but saw no one. "Are you at peace now?" I called into the wind, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Yes," the voice replied, a note of finality in its tone. "And you must carry on, knowing you have ended my torment." Relief washed over me, mingling with an aching sadness. I nodded, though there was no one to see it. "I will," I promised, the words swept away by the wind. Turning back to my car, I felt the weight of the night lift from my shoulders. The storm broke, rain falling in sheets, washing away the remnants of my fear. As I drove away, the woods receded into the background, becoming just another part of the landscape. The road home was long, but I drove with a sense of purpose now. The horrors I had experienced were real, but they were also behind me. I had faced the darkness, and though it would always be a part of me, it would not define me. As I crossed the threshold of my home, the familiarity of it enveloped me, a safe haven from the shadows. I knew I would carry the scars of that night forever, but I also knew I had survived. The night had tried to claim me, but I had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. And as I finally lay down to sleep, the darkness no longer a threat but a silent witness, I understood that some doors, once closed, must never be reopened. The night drive had ended, the story concluded, a chapter of horror closed with the dawn of understanding. In the deep, restful darkness, I found peace at last.